My uncle stood in the crowded courtroom, pointed directly at me, and laughed. "Look at her," he said loudly enough for the judge to hear. "She spent 6 years in the military and has nothing to show for it but dust on her boots, while my son built a real legacy." My cousin smirked, adjusting his expensive tie, confident that they were about to steal my late father's estate right out from under me. But as my uncle leaned over the podium to hand the judge his fake ownership papers, the judge's eyes bypassed him entirely and locked onto the small silver pin pinned to the inside lapel of my jacket. The judge's face drained of all color. His hands began to tremble. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice echoing across the silent courtroom. "You're her, aren't you?" Before I tell you how my uncle's arrogance utterly destroyed him, follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. My name is Clara Bennett, and I'm 28 years old. 2 weeks ago, I took off my military uniform for the last time and returned to a home that barely felt like home anymore. My father, the only real anchor I had left in this world, had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a modest piece of family land, a historic house, and the small logistics company he'd spent 30 years building from scratch. I didn't even have time to finish grieving before my father's older brother, Uncle Richard, swooped in like a vulture. Richard was a man who measured human worth strictly by bank accounts and tailored suits. To him, my 6 years of military service weren't a badge of honor, they were a complete failure. He loved to remind everyone who would listen that while his son Julian was making 6 figures in corporate consulting, I was out in the dirt playing soldier for peanuts. When Dad died, Richard didn't offer sympathy. Instead, he immediately took control of the company doors, locked me out of my father's office, and declared that a broke, traumatized girl had no business managing a real estate portfolio. He thought I was helpless. He thought my quietness was submission. Standing in the cold marble hallway outside the probate courtroom, watching Richard and Julian exchange smirks while adjusting their designer ties, I let them believe it. They thought they were walking in to claim an easy prize from a grieving daughter. They had no idea who I really was. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B swung open, and the chill inside hit me immediately. Uncle Richard strutted toward the front bench as if he already owned the building, his high-priced attorney trailing behind him with an overflowing leather briefcase. Julian sat right beside his father, leaning back with a smug grin that practically oozed entitlement. I sat alone at the petitioner's table. No team of lawyers, no flashy suits. Just me, sitting straight-backed, wearing my dark charcoal blazer over a simple black blouse. When the bailiff called our case, Richard didn't even wait for the judge to speak before leaning toward the podium. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice booming with performative authority. "This entire proceeding is a formality. My late brother knew he was in over his head. Before his passing, he rightfully entrusted the family land and his logistics company to my son Julian, a proven business mind who can actually protect his legacy." Richard turned his head slightly, casting a sneering look toward my table. "Unlike my niece here, who spent 6 years in the military and has nothing to show for it but dust on her boots. She's looking for a payout, Your Honor, but she lacks the capacity or the resources to manage an estate of this scale." A subtle murmur rippled through the spectators. Julian smirked, crossing his legs as his attorney handed a thick manila folder directly to the clerk. I didn't blink. I didn't interrupt. I just kept my eyes fixed ahead, holding my silence like a drawn bowstring. Richard took my calm expression for absolute defeat. He thought I was cowering. He was about to learn the difference between submission and waiting for the right moment to strike. Honorable Judge Miller sat behind the high mahogany bench, his eyes scanning the documents Richard's high-priced attorney had just submitted. "So," Judge Miller said, his voice deep and measured, "you're claiming a full transfer of all property, real estate, and business assets based on this signed agreement executed 2 months prior to the deceased's passing." "Precisely, Your Honor," Richard declared smoothly, resting his hands on the podium. "We simply want to honor my brother's final wishes, Clara is young, inexperienced, and clearly overwhelmed. Judge Miller shifted his gaze toward my side of the room. Petitioner Clara Bennett, do you have legal representation present today, or any formal objection to these documents? I stood up slowly, keeping my posture rigid and composed. No lawyer, Your Honor, I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. Just myself. As I stepped forward toward the center podium, my dark charcoal blazer unbuttoned slightly, brushing open to reveal the small silver pin pinned carefully to the inside lapel of my jacket, a discreet emblem featuring a shadowed shield and a silver raven. Judge Miller leaned forward to examine my movement, and then his entire demeanor froze. His eyes locked onto the small silver pin on my lapel. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. The thick stack of Richard's legal documents slipped from his hand, scattering across his desk. The judge's face drained of all color, his hands visibly trembling as he adjusted his glasses. Impossible, Judge Miller whispered, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the courtroom. You're her, aren't you? What my uncle and cousin saw as 6 wasted years in uniform was actually a life they couldn't even fathom. I hadn't spent my military career driving trucks or sitting in supply depots. For the last 4 years, I had served as a senior operative within a classified federal division known informally as the Silent Protectors, a joint military-civilian task force dedicated to dismantling complex corporate fraud, high-level embezzlement, and black market supply chain corruption. Judge Miller recognized my pin because 4 years ago, my unit had quietly exposed a massive racketeering network that had tried to blackmail several state officials, including Judge Miller himself. He knew what that silver raven meant. When a silent protector showed up, it meant an investigation was already finished, and the trap was already sprung. What Richard never realized was that my father knew everything. 8 months before he passed, Dad noticed strange discrepancies in his business accounts. He realized his own brother was secretly forging invoices and trying to drain the company's reserves. Devastated, Dad called me. Over the next 6 months, while Richard thought Dad was getting weaker, my father and I were quietly working together. Under my guidance, Dad didn't confront Richard. Instead, he gave Richard just enough access to hang himself. Every fraudulent signature Richard made, every unauthorized transfer Julian executed, and every fake contract they drafted was logged, recorded, and audited by federal forensic accountants. My father never left his legacy to Richard or Julian. 6 weeks before his passing, Dad legally transferred the entire estate into a private, irrevocable trust and appointed me as the sole trustee, with explicit instructions to let Richard push his fake documents all the way to a judge before delivering the final blow. Richard thought he was walking into a routine land grab. He had no idea he was stepping directly into a federal crime scene. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Richard stared at the judge in utter confusion, his confident posture suddenly faltering. "Your Honor?" Richard offered, trying to force a warm smile. "Is something wrong? If there's an issue with the paperwork, my attorney can—" "Silence, Mr. Bennett," Judge Miller snapped, his voice trembling not with anger but with overwhelming authority. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes remaining glued to the silver raven emblem on my lapel. "You swore under oath today that these transfer documents bear the true, uncoerced signature of your late brother?" "Of course, Your Honor," Richard declared, though a nervous twitch broke out beneath his right eye. "My brother willingly signed everything over to Julian. Clara is simply making wild accusations because she was left out." I didn't say a word. I simply unzipped my leather portfolio and stepped up to the podium. I placed a thick, blue-bound ledger directly on the bench, right over Richard's forged papers. "Your Honor, I said calmly, my voice resonating through the room. I am Clara Bennett, Senior Special Investigator with the Federal Asset and Fraud Division. What you have before you is an official forensic audit, backed by 6 months of bank records, digital footprint tracking, and federal surveillance. I turned my head slightly to look Richard dead in the eye. The signatures on my uncle's documents were forged 3 weeks ago using automated tracing software. I continued smoothly. Furthermore, the accounts my cousin Julian claims to manage were created to hide over $400,000 in embezzled funds from my father's logistics business. Julian's face went completely ghost white. The pen in Richard's hand slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the floor. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down, the sharp strike ringing out like a gunshot through the courtroom. The court hereby voids all documents presented by Richard Bennett, Judge Miller declared, his voice cold and uncompromising. Furthermore, based on the federal evidence submitted by Investigator Bennett, I am freezing all personal and business accounts associated with Richard and Julian Bennett immediately. Panic erupted at the defense table. Wait, Your Honor, this is a mistake, Richard yelled, his voice cracking as he grabbed his attorney's arm. She's setting us up. Julian, tell him. You handled the contracts. Don't pin this on me, Dad, Julian blurted out, backing away from his father in total horror. You told me we wouldn't get caught. You said she was just a stupid soldier who didn't know anything about money. Quiet, both of you, Judge Miller ordered. He looked over toward the side entrance of the courtroom and nodded. The heavy doors swung open, and 4 armed federal marshals walked in, their boots clicking firmly against the marble floor. The entire room held its breath as the officers moved directly toward Richard and Julian. Richard Bennett and Julian Bennett, the lead marshal announced, pulling silver handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and illegal forging of estate documents. Richard's face contorted in desperation as the cold steel snapped around his wrists. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of shock, fury, and sudden realization. The niece he had laughed at, the girl he had called a disgrace, had quietly dismantled his entire life without raising her voice once. As they dragged my uncle and cousin out of the courtroom, I stood still, watching in total silence as they faced the exact trap they had set for me. 3 months after that day in courtroom 3B, the dust finally settled. Uncle Richard and Julian both pled guilty to multiple federal charges. With their bank accounts frozen and their assets seized to pay restitution for years of illegal embezzlement, the luxury lifestyle they had boasted about dissolved overnight. They didn't just lose their freedom, they lost every single dollar they had tried to steal from my father. As for me, I stepped fully into my role as the sole trustee of my father's estate and company. With the corrupt elements removed, I brought in an honest management team and expanded our logistics operations into supporting veteran reintegration programs. Standing in my father's office, the very office Richard had locked me out of, I placed a framed photo of Dad on his desk, right next to my silver raven pin. I didn't seek revenge against my family out of malice. I did it because my father spent 30 years building an honest legacy, and he deserved to have it protected by someone who truly cared. Arrogant people often mistake quietness for weakness. They assume that if you don't boast or fight back immediately, you have no power. But the loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest one. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is the silent protector quietly waiting for the right moment to let justice take its course. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have confronted Richard right away, or waited to spring the trap like I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the video on your screen for another amazing story. Thank you for watching.